Good morning, everyone. Good to have you here. We do have some special guests today. Silas and Genesis Goma and their mom. You know, parents lose any identity when you become a parent. It's just now your mom or dad or whatever. But it's good to have them with us. Silas and Genesis, I taught in high school a few years ago. Genesis was in my honors English class, and Silas was in CP. And that was a few years ago. Genesis is now working on her PhD in psychology. And Silas works for space. What is it? Subcontractor for one of the space energy things going on. There you go. That's it. And it all started in my class. So there we go. I'll take credit for all of it. Oh, that's right. Silas just finished his master's program. So very proud of them. And so it's our pleasure to have them. If you remember a few years ago, they used to attend here every once in a while. And so they're still in the area. I did not know till last night. Actually, they were still here. So I'm glad to have them here. If you will, in your Bibles, turn to Psalms 119. That's where we're going to take our text today. Psalms 119, beginning with verse 30. Psalms 119, you might remember, is the longest psalm in the book of Psalms. It's based on the Hebrew alphabet. And we're not going to read the whole thing because it's pretty immense. One of these days we may look at the whole thing. But let's look at verse 30 through 32. I have chosen the way of faithfulness. Thine ordinances have I set before me. I cleave unto thy testimonies, O God. Put me not to shame. I will run the way of thy commandments when thou shalt enlarge my heart. How many of you hang around with people that are known to be thieves? Any of you hang around? Are they your best friends, your best buddies, people that you can trust? Not if they're a true thief. Because a true thief is a person without conscience. They take, and they don't care who it hurts. They just take because they want. And that's what a thief is. It's a person who just takes because this is something that they desire, regardless of how it affects another individual. So this morning, what I want to do is I want to introduce you to three thieves that I know about. So let me introduce you to the first one. His name is Emmanuel Ninger. You ever heard of him? Probably not. The year was 1887. The scene is a very small grocery store, and a middle-aged gentleman is in the store buying turnip greens. He gives the clerk a $20 bill, and she puts it in the cash drawer to give him his change. However, she's been wrapping turnip greens, and her hands are still a little wet, and as she takes this dollar bill from him, she notices that part of the ink from the dollar bill has come off and are on her fingers. Now, she looks at this guy, and he's been there for a number of years, and she's never thought anything wrong with him being there or anything else. And so she just kind of shoves it in the back of her mind and puts the bill in the drawer and gives him his change, and he goes. But she goes back and looks at this and she thinks, did he just give me a counterfeit $20 bill? And she picks it up and looks at it, and she calls the police. Well, the police come, and indeed it is a counterfeit $20 bill. And so they go to Emmanuel Ninger's home and find a very simple place, not that big a deal. And they look for counterfeiting material there, but they really don't find it until they go to the attic. And in the attic, they find how he did the $20 bill. He had an easel, he had a paintbrush, and he had paint. He had painted the $20 bill so perfect that it looked exactly like the real one. You see, what they began to find out about Emmanuel Ninger that nobody knew was that he was a master painter. In fact, not only did they find that in his home, they found several portraits of people that he had painted. And when it went up for an auction, the whole thing sold for around $16,000, about $5,000 per portrait. Now here's the real kicker. The amount of time that it took him to paint a $20 bill is the same amount of time it took him to paint a portrait of an individual. And yes, he went to jail for it. You see, Emanuel Ninger was a man who stole from himself. He had all the talent in the world to do something that was legal and proper, but just decided in some moment to do something that was illegal. So in essence, he was stealing from himself. He didn't use the talents and the abilities that God had given him to do something legitimately, so he did it wrongfully and paid the price. The second thief I want to tell you about is a man by the name of Arthur Berry. Any of you ever heard of Arthur Berry? He was a jewel thief in America in the 1920s, and he was a good one. In fact, he was known as kind of a snob because he didn't steal from just anybody. He only stole from the elite. I mean, you had to be somebody in a social circle for him to steal from. And it said that in the 20s that the women of Boston would rather boastfully announce that Arthur Berry had made a social visit, meaning he had just stolen some of her jewels, some of her diamonds. Well, the police didn't view him in the same way, obviously. And one night they caught him in the act. They shot him 3 times. He fell through a plate glass window. And on the ground, with 3 bullets in his body and glass piercing his entire body, he looked up and said the not so surprising idea, well, I ain't going to do this anymore. He went to the penitentiary, but he escaped and lived outside the penitentiary for 2 years until a jealous woman turned him back in, and then he went back to the penitentiary for 18 years. This time he did not escape. He served the full sentence. And when he got out, he went to a small New England town and this time kept his promise. I ain't going to do this anymore. And he didn't. In fact, Arthur Berry became a rather respectable citizen of this little town, so much so that they elected him commander of the local veterans organization, and he was president of it. As word began to leak out, though, as to who he really was, they began to understand they had in the middle of their town the world's most famous jewel thief of the 1920s. Well, this was the 1940s, obviously, but it didn't matter. He was still very famous. And so reporters from all over the United States gathered in this little town to talk to him and find out his view of life now. And one reporter asked him, from whom did you steal the most? You stole from a lot of wealthy people. Who did you steal the most from? And he said, oh, that's easy. You see, I could have been a baron on Wall Street. With the talent and the ability that God gave me, I could have been extremely successful in business. But instead, I spent 2/3 of my adult life in jail because I didn't utilize my talents properly. Here's a man who, like Emanuel Ninger, stole from himself. Now, the third thief. The third thief I want to introduce you to is you. See, any person, any boy or girl, any man or woman who doesn't use the inherent abilities that God has given them, and He's given us a lot of them, and uses them to glorify God and to raise Him up, is doing the same thing any thief does. We steal from ourselves. We're not allowing what God has given us to be the very thing to which God can be seen. And therefore, instead of standing on the promises, we're kind of creeping upon the promises. When a child was brought to Jesus to heal, in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus asked a pretty poignant question. Do you believe that I can do this? do you believe that I can do this? Now think about that. That's a good question. What is it that God can do today? What is it that we really believe that God can do today? Can he help us overcome, say, a temptation in our life that has been something that has been the bane of our existence, and we have dealt with this for years and years and years, but just can't quite seem to overcome it? Can he really help us overcome it, or is that just a lot of talk? Can he help us forgive that person or persons that we just can't get out of our mind? What they said to us years ago or yesterday or whenever, it's just something that eats at us and we just can't let go of it. Can God help us to forgive them so that that is just wiped out of our life? Can he help us reach people that are fallen, people that are lost, people that don't have him in their life? I mean, because some of these people are pretty calloused, and they really are not very interested in anything that we have to say or anything that God has to say. Can God help us to reach them? How about on a more practical level? Can God help us meet our weekly budget? Or is that just too much for him to handle? You know, when we talk about getting in meetings and we talk about deciding things for the church and this type of thing, is it something that we put God in the forefront of and we pray and we ask him for direction, or do we just kind of try to do it on our own steam? In Matthew 21, beginning with verse 18, Jesus said, all things, if you ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. Now, notice that didn't say, if you want something, I'll give it to you. God's not Santa Claus. You know, it's not something that we just want something and all of a sudden, oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. He said, if you ask for something and you believe. Now, what does that belief mean? The belief means that it's God's will. That's what God desires to happen. If you ask for something believing, you shall receive. Is that true? He also said in Mark 9, all things are possible to him who believes. And the father that he's talking to with the son says, I do believe. But then he says, but help my unbelief. In other words, I believe, but maybe I just don't believe enough. Maybe my belief just isn't at the point where it really needs to be. You see, many times the way I think we look at faith and belief is we're like that weary traveler back in the 1800s that came to the mighty Mississippi River in the winter, and it was frozen over. And he had to get to the other side. And daylight is fading away quickly. And he doesn't want to do this at night. But he doesn't know if the ice is strong enough to hold him up. And what happens if he gets halfway out there and falls through? Well, he dies. But he has to get over there, and he's desperate. And so what he does is he gets on his hands and knees, and he starts cautiously creeping across it, trying to redistribute the weight so that there's not too much weight in one area. And maybe he'll make it across. He's about halfway across when he hears somebody singing behind him. Turns around, and there's a sleigh full of coal drawn by 2 horses, and a guy sitting there singing as he whips right by him. Now consider the idea. Here he is, scared to death that this ice isn't going to hold him up, when a horse-drawn sleigh of coal that weighs maybe 3,000 pounds, 2 horses that weigh a couple of thousand pounds, a driver that weighs over 200 pounds, comes whipping by him, and the guy's singing without a care in the world. Help my unbelief. Like the traveler, I think many times this is the way that we approach God. We don't know if they're that sure. We're not quite convinced of it. So we get out and we kind of creep. And we kind of do this thinking that if we're very cautious and we're very timid, that as we venture upon the promises of God, that somehow the lightness of my step is going to make his assurances more secure. As if my timidity and in my reluctance, in some way, I'm going to contribute somehow, even the slightest, to the assurances of God. When we do that, we rob from ourselves. This is a God that when he spoke, things were created. He said, let there be light, and there was light. How do you do that? When he wanted to create man, he created man. When he wanted to create anything, he just did it. And this is the God that we can't trust, that we can't feel secure in, that we can't say, this is God's belief, and this is what he says, so this is what we do. Now, I know that some of you are sitting here saying, okay, what are you talking about? Because we stand on the promises of Christ our King. We just sang about it. I know we did. Well, what promises are you talking about? Are you talking about ask all things in my name and believing you'll receive? Are we that secure in what we believe? Or are we more secure in bank accounts and money and the size of the congregation than we are in the power behind the ones that are here? You see, when we get in business meetings and we get things like this, how many times do we pray to God, guide us, lead us, direct us, help us, empower us to do what it is that you want to be done? And it comes down to this. What is faith? I mean, when you talk about really, what is faith? To many Christians, faith is just an affirmation that there's a God. And that's it. That's faith. Yet James would argue with that. In James chapter 2, he says, what does it profit, my brothers, if a man says he has faith but does not have works? Faith in itself, if it has no works, is dead. In other words, you can talk a good game, but I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. He goes on. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac upon the altar? In other words, how did God know that this was the man that he really could count on? Because he took the only way that the promise of all of his descendants were going to come about in his son, and he was ready to give him up to God. And in that action, God says, I knew he had the faith that I could work through. In a book written by Richard Wurmbrand, who's an Orthodox Jewish individual, he talked about a period of time of imprisonment in a Bulgarian prison during the communist regime there. And talked about that he was put in prison with a lot of Christians. Two of them were very prominent ministers. Ministers that were known throughout Europe. Ministers that were internationally very, very famous. Had written several books. They were very, very popular. They had wonderful experiences with God. They had shown many gifts and manifestations of the Spirit in their lives. They were eloquent speakers. And among everything else, they knew about all the extraordinary provisions that God gives his people. And they were put in prison along with everybody else. So he started watching what was going on. And what was so disillusioning to him was, he said, the way that many Christians would just give up their faith under means of torture. And among the first ones to fall were the two Christian ministers. He said not only did they deny their faith, he said they began torturing other Christians under the communist guidance to prove how sincere they were in their now non-belief. And this was very grievous to Wurmbrand. He said, I don't know why someone would do that, especially someone who supposedly was so staunch and stalwart in their faith. And yet, after thinking about it for several years, after he was out of prison and everything, he said, I think I figured it out. The reason those men did not survive is because they related to God as the God who provides. This is a God who gives. This is a God who does things for you. And surely they had benefited greatly by God's provisions. But when those provisions were taken away, so was their faith. Because that's what their faith rested on. God gives. And what happens when God doesn't give? Well, then their relationship with God was flimsy at best. What is our faith in God? This is the crucial element. We have to have a foundational relationship to God in His holiness. And then that's really who God is. It's not what we get or what He gives. It's what He is. He is worthy of worship because of who He is. Now, has He done anything for us? Well, you're breathing. That's pretty good. He gave you the body. He gave you the air. Your heart's still beating. He gave you talents. We have cognitive abilities. We can think. We can process. We can do all that. And we didn't do that ourselves. We got that from somewhere. And I'd like to think that those are talents and abilities that were given to us by God. Now, the question is, so what are we doing with them? How are we allowing those abilities, those talents, those ideas to use to glorify God in what we do and how we act and the things that we say and that type of thing? You see, He is worthy of service because of who He is. And there's no other reason. He's worthy of our faithfulness. He's worthy of our humility. And He's worthy of our service because He's God and we're not. But who is God? Well, that's the question. And that's one we really have to have a good understanding of. Because that's the very faith that we say is the moral and central part of the universe. Is who is God. That's the center of everything we have as far as faith, is who is God. And if we rob ourselves of an understanding that's going to basically elevate us into the realm of true faith that passes understanding, we rob ourselves. Because I think we need to go back to that says, it goes past understanding. It goes past something that we can really grasp all the time. So why do things happen the way they happen? I don't know. I don't know why the children die. I don't know why the people get diseases. I don't know why we have aches and pains. I don't understand a lot of that. But the reason I don't is because I'm not God. So that's where we have to just kind of go into the realm of we just have to trust and obey. And what if you are in a prison and you are being tortured? Is that enough to give up your faith? Because for some people it was. Because God wasn't giving anymore. As if that was the essence of God in the first place. You see, faith is more than knowing there's a God. It's defining what He is, and it's defining who He is in our mind. And if we get the wrong concept, we can go down a bad path. But if we can rely on an understanding that a belief in God for who He is and what He is truly as being the God of the universe that created us all and loves us all and gave His only Son for us, as we talked about just a moment ago, then that becomes a belief. That becomes an underpinning faith that guides and sustains us regardless of what else happens. Then we don't steal from ourselves. Then we can do all things through Christ that strengthens us. Does that mean we're going to understand it? No. It means I have enough faith in the God above, knowing that He loves me, that whatever happens to me in this life, then that's the plan. I don't have to understand it. I just have to have enough faith to know that He's in charge. And if He's in charge, then that's fine. So, Have you been stealing from yourself? If our faith is in nothing more than a God who gives, we have been. But if our faith in God is something that is more substantial, it is more solid, it's in the God of the heavens and the earth, the God that created it all, the God that loves us beyond anything we could ever reasonably understand, but God that will also allow us to suffer. He will allow us to have pain. He will allow all these things to happen to us because the end result is the key. Remain faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. And that is the crowning achievement of all life. Together, as we are going to be singing an invitation song in just a moment, what we're going to be doing is looking at ourselves and just saying, do I fall short? If so, then go to God. He's there all the time. He will forgive and he will forget. And so will brethren. We are all here for that. Or if you've not dedicated your life, and you feel like this is a God that you can relate to, this is a God that you actually can give your life up to and say, you know what, I'm ready to make that commitment, then good. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's the evidence of things not seen. And if you have that kind of faith and want to walk by faith, and you need to walk by faith this morning, we ask you to come as together we stand and sing to encourage you at this time.